All right, Alexander, let's do an update as to what is going on in Ukraine. And of course, we're going to start with Bakhmut. And the situation in Bakhmut seems to get worse for Ukraine with each passing day, each passing hour. And there are reports that, analysis at least, that Russia is perhaps going to be widening their cauldron, or perhaps creating a cauldron within another cauldron. We're not saying that's 100%, but there is some thought that Russia is going to perhaps get, let's say, more aggressive and perhaps widen things out. We'll see. And then let's touch upon Schultz's trip to DC. I think that's going to be an interesting meeting between Schultz and Biden. They're going to discuss Ukraine, and from what I gather, they're also going to be discussing sanctions on China, potential sanctions on China. So let's start with on the ground.
Let's talk about the situation on the ground. Now, can I just, this is a dynamic situation. I mean, I did a video for my own channel in which I said that it seemed to me as if the Russians might be pulling back from a bigger cauldron. I thought that they were going for a bigger cauldron before. Today it looked briefly as if they weren't. Now I've actually swung back to your view, by the way. It does look as if Russian advances are even faster and stronger than I imagined. And we're getting lots of information. And I think the first point to make is, yes, in my previous video, the previous video we did, I said that I wasn't completely sure about these reports that soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers in Bakhmut were basically starting to rebel and demand to be pulled out. I think we can now say with reasonable certainty that that is indeed what is happening. There was a Ukrainian soldier come blogger called Magwar, by the way, that he's not Hungarian apparently. But anyway, he was complaining that, you know, it was made no sense to keep him and the others in Bakhmut, and he made a public call about that. And one's starting to hear that more and more soldiers are echoing his words, and that this even includes some of the troops from the nationalist battalions, from IDAR and all the others, that have been sent to this to Bakhmut to basically try and hold the line there. So it does look as if there's a gathering collapse of morale. I should say that after Magwar published his video statement, the Ukrainian military immediately evacuated his unit from Bakhmut. So he's got out, or he's getting out. I'm not quite sure whether he's actually out yet. But we don't know what they're going to do with the others. But anyway, putting that aside, weakening resistance of Ukrainian forces. And I've just looked at some maps. The most accurate one that I've seen shows that the Russians have, in fact, advanced rapidly, very fast over the last couple of hours. They're now literally on one of the, there's two roads to the west. They're literally on one road leading into Bakhmut from the west. And on the other one, they're just half a kilometer away, which probably means they'll cut the road at some point within the next hours. And when that happens, we're talking about a full encirclement. But when you look at the map, the wider picture of the map, you're quite right. It does now look as if there's more Russian forces advancing from all sorts of directions. And it does look as if they're aiming for a wider cauldron. So it's a critical situation. And we'll see how it evolves over the next couple of hours or days, and what the Russians do and what Ukraine does. But certainly it looks very, very bad for Ukraine. And, one wonders, we're not going to rehearse and go over the whole thing all over again. But one does wonder about the nature of some of the decisions that have been made in Kiev. Because, of course, if we do end up with a bigger cauldron and, many more men trapped than looked likely even a few days ago, well, what has Ukraine achieved by all its defense of Bakhmut, other than an even bigger disaster than, the one it might have had if it had pulled out earlier? But, we're not going to talk about that today. We've talked about that so often that I think we would be at risk of repeating ourselves. But you're absolutely right. A bigger cauldron does now look to be evolving.
Well, before we move on to Schultz's trip to DC, what do you make of the fact that Newsweek is reporting that Ukraine is moving resources for an attack in the south, in the Zaporozhye region? Do you believe those reports or not?
I do believe those reports, and I'll tell you why. Because we've heard so much about this. If there isn't a Ukrainian attack on Zaporozhye over the next few weeks, then frankly, it seems to me that Ukraine has essentially accepted that it's lost the war. So I think the Ukrainians probably are trying to move troops to Zaporozhye, but it's increasingly looking as if when they do so, they're scraping things together rather than putting together significant forces to do it. I read that Newsweek article. It spoke about Zaporozhye being less well defended by the Russians. I don't know where they got that one from. I saw all those pictures some weeks ago of the defenses that the Russians have created in this area. I have to say that, to me, it looks as if the Russians are determined to defend themselves in this part of the world. But, who knows? But I'm going to say this offensive that's been talked about, this is Ukraine's last throw. I mean, everybody now effectively is saying as much. If this offensive doesn't happen, or if it happens and it fails, then Ukraine has irretrievably lost the war. Because everywhere, everybody who's commenting about this accepts that Ukraine is being ground down in every other part of the battlefronts, and that the rates of loss are too high, and that Western support for Ukraine is starting to ebb away. Even the American media is basically saying that Ukraine only has until the summer before the tide turns irretrievably against it. Even General Austin said it at Ramstein. And by the way, today there's another article about another part of the battlefronts. The Guardian is, for the first time, coming very close to admitting that Kupyansk, a town to the north, which was captured by Ukraine during its Kharkiv counteroffensive, might be on the brink of falling to the Russians again. So Ukraine is facing an operational crisis in Bakhmut. It's under pressure in every other part of the battlefronts. I think that some kind of offensive in Zaporozhye region has to happen. Otherwise, Ukraine might as well accept that it's lost the war and sit down and talk with the Russians and concede what the Russians demand, because the war is lost.
Yeah, even I believe the Estonian, I don't want to say the prime minister, though she did make some comments echoing what you said, but I think maybe the foreign minister of Estonia or someone very high up in the Estonian government said that the only thing that can save Ukraine is NATO intervention or nuclear strike. I mean, that was what this person said. I just can't, I'm looking for to find out who said it, but I can't find the exact, I think it was the foreign minister, but I could be wrong, of Estonia. And
I think
anyway,
you're right, actually. I remembered. Yeah.
Yeah, when you have a leader in the Baltic nations, which have been very pro-war, pro-Ukraine in this conflict, saying that not much can help Ukraine outside of a NATO intervention, then it's really bad. I just want to make a point about Zaporozhye. I think Zaporozhye, the reason they always focus on Zaporozhye is because the narrative has always been that Zaporozhye is easy to defeat, and it's going to be through Zaporozhye that you're going to cut off Crimea. I mean, that's been the dream. They've been fixated on this attack, this dream that they're going to cut through Zaporozhye, go down to Melitopol, and they're going to break the land bridge and take Crimea. I mean, that's been this fantasy battle strategy that they've had from day one. That's why they're so fixated on it.
I completely agree. By the way, I mean, I have to say, I was reading an article, I discussed it on my own channel, by a man called Richard Kemp in the Daily Telegraph, who, fully supports this plan. And he was quoting General Ben Hodges, ardent supporter of Ukraine, as we all know, talking about this plan. But, Richard Kemp admitted Ukraine doesn't have the strength to succeed in carrying this out unless it gets an awful lot more Western aid than it's getting at the moment. So that calls into question, to my mind, the entire idea of this operation. Because, I mean, all that huge activity to provide tanks to Ukraine. Ukraine wanted, was it 300? They've been promised 200. They're not going to get those 200 until, well, they won't all arrive until next year, apparently. So, I mean, they're not getting the tanks. They're not getting the infantry fighting vehicles. They needed, I think it was 600 to 700 of those. They've got about, I think, 140. So, I mean, they're not getting enough of those. And, of course, they talked about howitzers, and, they needed 500 howitzers. So, and I believe that the numbers of howitzers they've got is numbered in the tens, not the hundreds anymore, the new ones in the West. And we see all the ammunition problems. So Kemp comes along and says, we've got to provide much more support to Ukraine for it to succeed. But where's the support coming from? The cupboard is bare. So Ukraine is being pushed into this offensive towards Zaporozhye. This idea that this is the silver bullet is going to kill Russia, knock Russia out of the war, capture Crimea. It's. I think this is delusional, but there we go. That's no doubt what they're going to try and do. And of course, everywhere else on the battlefields, things for Ukraine are going from bad to worse. We have an operational crisis in Bakhmut. The Russians are now literally on the doorstep at Kupyansk. They seem to be meters away from the outskirts of the town, not even kilometers anymore. And, the situation on the battlefields looks increasingly grim. And there's more and more articles in the media that admit that.
Yeah, a lot of articles are starting to admit that. So anyway, let's wrap things up and talk about Olaf Scholz going back to D.C. A little over a year from his last trip to D.C. when Biden made that incredible statement about Nord Stream, that he's going to take care of Nord Stream. That was Scholz. That was standing next to him, and Schultz is now back in D.C., and they're going to coordinate their Ukraine strategy, and they're going to coordinate their China sanctions strategy. What do you make of this trip?
Yeah,
from
and the most
Schultz
interesting
to D.C.
Yeah, the most interesting thing about it is that Scholz is going there basically by himself. Now, mostly when a German chancellor visits Washington, he goes with journalists from the German media. He goes with business people. And this time he's not going with either. And apparently there's not even going to be a press conference. So it's going to be not a secret meeting, but a very private meeting. And he doesn't want to be asked questions. And I have to say, when that happens, when in the past you've had situations where leaders meet, but they're not prepared to discuss what they've said to each other before the media or take questions, it's usually a sign that there are differences. And I think there might be on this occasion. Now, there are obvious topics that might be embarrassing for Scholz. He doesn't want to go to a press conference and be asked about Nord Stream. You know, who do you think blew up Nord Stream? He doesn't want to have those kind of questions asked with Biden, the man Seymour Hersh and all the world believes was the perpetrator, standing next to him. I mean, that would be a very bad look for Olaf Scholz. No doubt the media in Germany have been told, under no circumstances, ask those questions. So, but having said that, apparently we're not going to have the media there at all to make sure that we don't have those kind of questions asked. But I suspect there's other things too. I suspect that Biden is going to be pushing Scholz hard on sanctions against China, because this is now what's coming. And Scholz doesn't want either the media there or the business people, because the business people will tell him, you know, Olaf, if you agree to this, then you've completely taken leave of your senses. You are the mad chancellor. Germany cannot agree to sanctions against China. So you can understand why the media isn't there. You can understand that there are going to be issues and differences between Scholz and Biden. But I think the big problem, the big concern is going to be China and the sanctions that Biden is certainly going to float before Scholz over China. And I think Scholz will not want to agree to sanctions. And as I said, I don't think he wants to be questioned about this, and I don't think he wants to be put on the spot by his own business people.
You want to place some bets that eventually Olaf Scholz will fold to sanctions with China, sanctions against China?
No. I'm not a betting man. If I bet against that, well, you know what they say about a fool being parted from his money. I'm not going to be parted from my money in that way. Of course, he's going to agree. He always agrees to everything. He agrees to every single demand that Biden has made of him. He said he wouldn't agree to Russia being disconnected from SWIFT. He agreed to Russia being disconnected from SWIFT. He said that he wouldn't agree to sanctions on Russian energy. He agreed to sanctions on Russian energy. He said he wouldn't supply military equipment to Russia. He supplied military equipment to Russia. He said he wouldn't give tanks to Russia, to Ukraine rather. He said he wouldn't give tanks to Ukraine. He's given tanks to Ukraine. He's going to agree to anything that's put in front of him. He'll protest, he'll complain, he'll say he won't do it, but he invariably does. And his party is draining support. It's just lost an election in Berlin, which is a SPD stronghold. And but he's going to go on doing it because he can't say no. And of course, he also knows that the Greens, Baerbock and Habeck, if he does say no, will work overtime to undermine him. And it's known that he can't stand Baerbock, but he can't do anything about her, apparently.
Yeah. Lavrov said in his press conference at the G20, at a press conference after the event, the Raisina conference dialogue 2023, Lavrov said that Germany was, in reference to the Nord Stream sabotage, Germany was humiliated physically and morally, I believe he said. He's right.
He's absolutely right. I mean, he holds the position once occupied by Bismarck and other great leaders. Willy Brandt, Konrad Adenauer, Helmut Schmidt, Helmut Kohl. But he is Mr. He's a man of party. I mean, they can just bend him into whatever shape they want. And Germany, meanwhile, goes down the tubes. I mean, because already it's in recession, apparently. Inflation is rising there again. All the problems that we said were going to come about. They're coming about. But of course, when Biden says sanctions on China, first he'll say no, and then he'll say yes. We know he will. He always does.
Yeah. All right, we'll leave it there. The Duran.locals.com. We are on Rockfin as well, and go to the Duran shop. 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.